Your brain on Klingon and your brain on English are surprisingly similar. In fact, it turns out our brains respond to artificial languages much like natural ones. But what does that tell us? For centuries, philosophers of language have debated what constitutes a language. If English isn't a language, what is? Ditto French or Latin or Urdu or Brazilian Portuguese, but are whistled languages also languages? Is math, music? What we mean when we call something a language is itself up for philosophical debate. Trust me, philosophers are so fun at parties. But some cognitive neuroscientists, like the ones in the Fedorenko lab at MIT, are adding some empirical measurements to the mix by looking at our brains as we interface with linguistic elements. Science can't define what a language is for us, but we can use scientific techniques to see what types of reasoning and communication our brain treats the same as it treats natural language. And when it comes to measuring how our brains treat that reasoning and communication, the most common tools of the cognitive neuroscience trade are things like the functional MRI, which measures blood flow to different regions of the brain. They also measure electrical signals with electroencephalography, magnetic fields created by our brain's electrical signals using magnetic encephalography, and other imaging and recording techniques that are variations on the theme of measuring what parts of the brain have activity while doing this thing. So, what have those techniques taught us? For one, our brains don't respond to everything with language in the name the same way it responds to natural languages. Previous studies found that programming languages, like Python, don't use the same functional regions of the brain as natural language. Instead, we use a different network, the multiple demand network in the middle there, which we also use for math and some types of reasoning tasks. These researchers then wanted to see if artificial constructed languages, aka conlangs, are processed the same way English is, or instead the way Python is, or maybe even a secret third thing. To do so, they had to get data from a range of conlang users, which resulted in a wildly nerdy conference. These scientists hosted a conference at MIT and invited a bunch of people from various conlang communities. There were speakers of Esperanto, a language intended for international communication. There were speakers of Klingon from Star Trek, Na'vi from the Avatar film series, and High Valyrian and Dothraki from the Game of Thrones TV series. Creators of some of the languages were on site. Not the creator of Esperanto, of course, that was invented in 1887. But each language had expert speakers constructing linguistic examples in each conlang to test the conference attendees. Those attendees, in turn, completed self-assessments of their competence in their conlang of choice, actually tested that competence, and then they got a whole battery of brain activity tests while using and listening to that language. I share these methodological details to tell you how this research was performed. Yeah, sure. But also because the mental image of this conlang conference for linguistic turbo nerds is delightful. And I bet it was so much fun. And before we move on, a few details to note about the languages in question. All of them are artificially constructed languages by definition, but because they were each constructed for different purposes, including many for film and television, the languages themselves have different features that could be relevant to how our brains process them. For instance, Esperanto was built to be an easy-to-pick-up second language for people who may have spoke any of a wide range of primary languages. The language started out with fewer than 1,000 root meanings that could be expanded with prefixes, suffixes, and compounds, which means a language learner doesn't have to learn as many vocab words and can understand new words as long as they already understand the root word and they understand the structure that modifies it. Its vocabulary and structure overtly draw on existing Indo-European languages in particular to make it easy to learn for speakers of those languages. You can even see that in the language name. Esperanto translates as one who hopes, and it's related to the English word aspire, the French word espoir, the Spanish word espero, and so on. Esperanto's purpose is to be an easy-to-learn international language, and we can see that reflected in the features that are built into the intentional construction of this language. Klingon, on the other hand, is a fictional language spoken by space aliens, whose language did not evolve in dialectic with Earth's languages, so it is built to be intentionally avoiding resemblance with existing languages. Obviously, it still has to be capable of being spoken by human actors on the TV show, but its sounds and grammar deliberately eschew the most common linguistic patterns and features of English in particular, right down to the word order. It's the opposite of Esperanto. One built to feel familiar to speakers of natural Earth languages, one built to feel alien. And that is the kind of thing we could imagine our brains responding differently to. Or maybe linguistic completeness really matters in some way. A lot of Klingon vocab is about spacecraft, a lot less is about the bakery aisle at the grocery store. Maybe the community of speakers matters. According to estimates in this paper, tens of thousands of people speak Esperanto, but only about 10 people in the world actually use Dothraki as a language. Totally possible that our brains treat that differently from a language that we, use at the bank. But here's a figure from the paper that shows brain activity patterns in speakers of each of these conlangs, which I'm comparing against natural language patterns from the review article we saw earlier. On the right, you can see that all of the different conlangs have activation in roughly the same functional regions of interest, and they all match the pattern we associate with the language network of the brain on the left. Also, while we're looking at this, I just think it's very whimsical how they made the plots for the Na'vi blue, and the Klingon ones match Worf's uniform, the Esperanto plot matches the Esperanto flag and all that. They didn't have to do that. It's just a little cute. And I like it. And here's the thing. On some level, it feels pretty intuitive that our brain treats conlangs that are used as a language as languages. Even ones like Klingon that don't share a lot of features with these speakers' primary languages. It didn't surprise me to read this paper and learn that our brains respond to Python differently than they respond to English or Esperanto. Yeah, we call it a programming language, but reading code does subjectively feel like a distinct cognitive activity from reading the comments in that same code. So, on some level, these results may seem almost trivially true. Wow, our brain can't tell the difference between a natural and constructed language. But bring it back to Python for a moment. What is it about Python that makes our brain handle it differently? Python's got syntax, it's got semantics, and though its purpose is to ultimately compile to bytecode on a machine, it's still written in a way that humans are intended to comprehend and derive meaning from. It's got plenty of features of things used in human language. The Venn diagram simply isn't a perfect circle with those natural human languages. So there's a whole continuum of constructions that have linguistic features but don't activate our brain the same way natural language does, like Python. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are constructions that activate our brain exactly the way natural language does, apparently like a High Valyrian. By doing this study, these cognitive neuroscientists found that place for conlangs on the continuum. In so doing, it teaches us that, 1, none of the features that make conlangs different from each other, and 2, none of the features that make conlangs different from natural languages are deal breakers when it comes to activating our brain's language network. It's yet another condition that compares and contrasts against brain activity patterns for spoken natural languages, or whistled languages, or sign languages, or pidgin languages from different language speakers who were thrown together and trying to figure out some way to communicate. And we can look at how all of those stack up against even more distant types of cognition, like music. The more of this continuum we populate, the more we learn about our brain's internal architecture of language. So even if it seems trivial at first that, yeah, our brains brain on Esperanto pretty much the same way they brain for English, in fact, it meaningfully contributes to a larger body of literature aimed at identifying how our brains assemble these various aspects of the tools we use to communicate, and which features prompt our brain to use the language network that has gotten us so far. And what can one say to that but kapla? Wait, that's a Vulcan gesture. That's a whole different language. Kapla.